And welcome back to the All About Photography podcast, where we discuss anything and everything photography related. With a new episode coming out every Monday night at midnight on your favorite podcasting platforms. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, or if you want to watch the video version of the podcast, you can watch it on the Pien Photography YouTube channel, where the video podcast will go up at the same time as well. So for those of you watching on YouTube, hello! And I made sure not to hit the microphone this week, so hopefully I haven't damaged your ears yet. And as always, if you would like to reach out, I have left my email address in the show notes for you if you are listening to the podcast, or if you are watching on YouTube, you are welcome to leave a comment as well. I do try to get back to all of them as soon as I can with hopefully a clear response, which I know I haven't always been the best at doing that in my previous YouTube videos, but I digress. And if you would like to stay up to date with future episodes, don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to your podcast, because I do try to get a podcast episode out every week. This is the 10th episode that I've done so far, and I don't have any plans on stopping it anytime soon, except maybe over the Christmas break, but we'll wait and see how that goes. But speaking of that, there will be an episode coming out about gifts you can get as a photographer to another photographer, or as someone who has a photographer as a partner or a family member. Gifts that you can consider giving them over the Christmas period if that's something that you're looking at doing. Just a quick heads up, I do have a slight cold, so I may sound a little bit different today, but I'm not going to let that stop me from recording this episode, because there is quite a bit I want to go over regarding two new cameras that have been released. So if I do sound different now, at least you know why. But we'll get into this week's episode now without any further delay. On to this week's episode. It is a little bit of a follow-up from last week where we went over the Sony a7R5, which this, I have to say, is quite an amazing camera. But this week we have two more cameras that have just been released as well, which is the Canon R6 Mark II, which I am actually quite excited about, and the Fujifilm XT-5, which is actually worth discussing because Fujifilm has gone on a bit of a different trajectory with this one. I will go over the Fujifilm XT-5 first and the Canon R6II later, so if you want, you can skip through to the Canon part of the Fujifilm doesn't interest you too much, but I thought it would be worth discussing it anyway. The Fujifilm XT-5, it is their successor to the XT-4, where it's got a similar body, but it's a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter by about 50 grams, but it is using their crop sensor from the XH2, which is their video-focused camera. But what Fujifilm has done with the XT-5 is they've made it much more so a photo or photography-centered camera, much more than video, where a lot of camera manufacturers, you know, your Sony, your Canon, your Nikon, are not just pushing the photography features and specs that they have, but they're also putting a lot of effort into the video features each of their camera has. Well, in this particular case, Fujifilm's just mostly focused on the photography aspect of it. There's not too much video side. Most of the information I've been able to find out regarding the video is just that you can shoot in 4K with a slight crop, and it's oversampled. That's about it. Fujifilm's probably done that because they have got their more expensive XH2, which is, from the amount of information I've seen, is quite a good video camera if you did want to do more video than photo work. But if you wanted to do more photo work, then the XT5 is the way that you should be going. Now, it is a 40 megapixel crop sensor, which for a crop sensor is huge. Most crop sensors that come out are normally only 24 megapixels, because once you go above that, the actual pixels on the sensor become so small that you have to then start worrying about how much noise there'll be if you're shooting at higher ISOs and how much detail that there would actually be, because you've got such small sensors that are then being expanded into such a large image. Will the image qualities be as good as you would expect? And spec-wise, their native ISO is 125 to 12,800, but you can expand it from 64 to 51,200. But as I mentioned, though, when you are shooting high ISOs on a crop sensor camera, just be prepared that there would be quite a bit of noise. But it does have 7 stops of in-body stabilization, which is insane. And that's on the camera itself. That's not when it's used with any other lens. That's just what the actual camera offers, which anybody who shoots with a crop sensor knows how important image stabilization can be because of the actual fact that you're using a crop sensor. If you're using a 24 millimeter lens, once you factor in the crop, you're actually shooting at 35. So with the new stabilization, you can comfortably shoot slower than 1/50th of a second on that 24 millimeter camera, or 24 millimeter lens, sorry, without having to worry about camera shake because it's got so much stabilization now. It also does have the 160 megapixel multi-shot high-res mode, where effectively the sensor moves by half a pixel between each frame, and then it takes 20 frames to make sure that every single of the red, green, and blue pixel has got the same information, and then that way the final image has no false colors. So what it does is it takes an image, moves the sensor half a pixel, takes another image, but it makes sure that it got the entire red, green, blue aspects and ratios in there for every single image it's taken, and then combines all of it together. That way no color is missing. You've got all the colors you need and a lot of detail out of that image as well. The only thing you have to bear in mind is that it's a 160 megapixel image. And it also does have a maximum shutter speed of 1/180 thousandths of a second. Not 8,000, which most cameras offer, but 1/180 thousandths. I'm even struggling just to say how fast it is because it's so bloody fast, and I've never even seen such a speed on a camera before, excluding naturally the super high frame rate video cameras that are available nowadays. When you're using that, imagine if you really, really, really wanted to freeze the action, but you don't mind, shooting at a very shallow depth of field and potentially a high ISO to be able to get that insanely fast shutter speed. I can't even fathom when you would need such a fast shutter speed at all, actually, because I've seen lots of images shot at 1/4000th of a second that have frozen the action perfectly regardless of the type of photography that you're doing. But I'm sure somebody will find a use case for that sort of speed as to where it can be applicable to their particular photography genre. It can do 15 frames per second, and you get about 19 raw images before the buffer fills up. So just bear that in mind. If you're going to press and pray, then after about 19 images, you're going to have to wait for the buffer to clear itself, write all those images to the memory cards before you can actually go and take photos again. Speaking of memory cards, it is dual card slot where they both support UHS 2, not CF Express Type A or anything. So that's probably why you've only got the 19 frames or the 19 raw images before the buffer fills up, because there's only so many images that can be written to a card at any particular time before, it's just too much data going through that the card can't process it. You can charge the camera with USB if you wanted to, like while you're out and about, plug it into a power bank, and so you don't have to worry about draining all of your batteries too quickly. And as for the autofocus, which a lot of brands are doing this now, and I forgot to mention it in last week's episode regarding the Sony a7R5 because a lot of the features are the same, is it does have your single AF focus point, but you can also have continuous autofocus on subjects such as animals, birds, cars, motorcycles, bicycles, airplanes, and trains. Just bear in mind, if you're out shooting a train on the railroad, don't get in the way of the train. If you think about it, if it's you versus a train is going to win. There's no doubt about that. There's no second guessing that. A train will hurt you and potentially unalive you if you get in the way of the train whilst you're trying to get your image. Go take all the train images you want. I'm not saying don't do it. Just don't put your life at risk in order to get the picture of the train, though. You versus a train is going to win. It's the same like you versus a car is going to win. But one thing I don't understand with this camera, and maybe someone can enlighten me onto it, is it's got a 3-way tilting LCD screen. So it goes up, it goes down, and it goes to one side only. As I mentioned last week, having a fully articulating, rotating LCD screen is a lifesaver. It just allows you so much more flexibility and creativity than not having it. And I'm pretty sure it's probably easier to engineer than the 3-way tilting screen Fujifilm's got, because it's got 2 separate hinges on it. One to go up and down, and then one to go sideways. I mean, why not just give you a fully articulating one and let you be as creative as you want? That's all down to personal preference. I know that a lot of people may not care about that extra feature, but it is a deciding factor for me. As small as it may seem, I just want to have that full flexibility that I can rotate the screen any way I want and not have to worry about my angles or anything being off whilst trying to take it and having to try multiple times to get the same image instead of just getting it the first or second time. For those who like the way that the Fujifilm cameras feel, as I mentioned earlier, it is a little bit lighter because it is a little bit smaller than the XT-4, but it still maintains all of the retro dials that Fujifilm cameras are known for, where you've got your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture on the lenses, as well as your exposure dial is on there as well. So if you did want to have the options to change them manually using dials, then yes, the Fujifilm is the camera for you to get. If not, then there are so many other brands that you can choose from. I'm not shitting on Fujifilm. I think some of their images that they make are great. They make absolutely fantastic lenses from the ones that I've tried, but I just prefer having more availability from lenses, even though I've only got 2, than what they offer. Plus, I want the full frame capabilities, which Fujifilm doesn't offer. They only have crop sensors or medium format, but nothing in between. But I digress. That's neither here nor there. This is just more talking about the new camera than my personal opinions as to why I will not go Fujifilm. If you do have the XT4, you can, or the XT3 for that matter, you can use the same battery for the XT5. So that way, at least you don't have to worry about going out and buying new batteries and potentially extra chargers or third-party chargers if you want to charge more than one battery at a time. So that is one good thing. And it is definitely a photo-focused camera. There's minimal video features on it. It's much more so this is a camera for photographers, not as a hybrid camera for video and photo, or a video-centric camera. If you want a video-centric camera, go for the XH2. This camera is purely targeted towards photographers by the looks of it, and for those who like to have that retro feel of turning the dials instead of just rolling the wheels around. Is this a camera worth upgrading to? Well, it depends if you're currently shooting with Fuji, if you've got an XT3 or an XT4 and you want to get the fact that it's got a new 40 megapixel sensor. It depends if you're a photographer who's doing this as a career and you can easily recoup the cost of an XT5, or if you're doing it as a hobby but you just want to upgrade because of the fact that it's got that new sensor on it. It's also quite decently priced at $1,700 and it will be available next week, actually, at the time that this is being recorded. So, or in 2 weeks, I should say, not next week, in 2 weeks. So it is something that you can consider if you're currently in the Fujifilm system. If you're thinking about getting into the Fujifilm system, then if you're happy with the fact that it's a crop sensor and not a full frame, but that you also have to factor in there is no upgrade to a full frame camera though. Apart from crop sensor, it just goes straight up to medium format. So you do have to bear that in mind. But as I said though, Fujifilm does make amazing lenses that you can use. So it is a camera worth considering because they are nice and small and light, easy to carry around, and they do produce amazing images, and you do have their film simulations that you can continue to use with their XT5 as well. I know a lot of Fujifilm shooters love to rave about those film simulations. I am not a fan of them because I'd rather just shoot RAW and then use a preset in Lightroom if I wanted to do that, versus have Fujifilm do the processing and give me a JPEG, not a RAW file, but a JPEG with their film simulation on it. I'm not saying my preference is the best preference, it's just my preference. Everybody's got their own, and I'm not going to shit on anyone's preference if it makes them happy. So that's the Fujifilm X-T5. It's a nice camera that's come out. It's nice to see that Fujifilm's making some strides there and that they've got a crop sensor with, such a high megapixel range. So it is a decent camera by the looks of it. But as always, when it comes to shooting in a crop sensor, I'm always just concerned about what happens at high ISOs, because from my experience, even shooting at 24, it's already very noisy once you get to about ISO 8000. I can't even imagine what it's going to be like shooting with a 40 megapixel crop sensor at something like ISO 8000. It's just going to be very noisy, I think. But I'm happy to be proven wrong. But onto the more exciting camera. And for me, this one's exciting because of the fact I am a Canon shooter. I'm not saying I will always be with Canon, but as I'm currently with Canon and it's cheaper and easier to just stay with the system versus swap, I'm quite excited about this camera that's being released, and that's the Canon R6 Mark II, which is a bit odd that Canon's released the R6 Mark II because normally there's about 4 to 5 years in between new camera releases, and this one only came out 2.5 years after their initial R6. I think it was in July 2020 they released the R5 and the R6, which are both amazing cameras. Do not get me wrong. If I could go with an R5 today, I would. The only reason I wouldn't have considered an R6 is because of the fact it was a 20 megapixel sensor versus my EOS R's 30 megapixels. And as I print photos and I like to print them large, I want to have the flexibility where I can crop a little bit and not lose too many pixels and still print large and have my images be tack sharp on the actual print itself. Which is why I'm excited about the R6 Mark II, because it's a 24 megapixel sensor up from their previous 20 megapixel sensor. So even for me, who's a landscape photographer and likes to print large, 24 megapixels is sufficient. You don't actually need to go 45 or 60 megapixels if you want to print large. You can still print very large at 24 megapixels. At 20, it's pushing it a little bit, but at 24, it's definitely doable. It does have their CMOS Digic X processor, so the camera is using the latest processor that they've currently got, and it does have 4,897 focus points, which is one of the things that's great about Canon, is they have so many focus points that you can choose from that you really are only limited by yourself if you want to make sure that you focus on the right spot, because you don't have a big box where You might miss focus. You've got so many options to choose your focus and make sure that you nail it. Its native ISO is 100 to 102,400. Is that right? Yes, 102,400. But you can expand it from down to ISO 50 and all the way up to 204,800. I can't even imagine how much noise there's going to be at that high. I already stopped with the EOS R. I don't even go above 8,000 because it gets too noisy, let alone 25,000. So 204,000 just sounds absolutely ridiculous. It does have 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter and 40 frames per second with the electronic shutter, which, if you listened to last week's episode and I was confused as to why Sony's had the 10 frames mechanical and 7 frames electronic, this makes more sense. Because with the electronic shutter, there is no actual shutter that has to be moved. It's just software doing it. And from the information I've seen so far is there's not too much warping and the rolling shutter is not too bad. So it seems Canon has done quite a bit of work in the algorithm to make sure that that's not an issue. So that's very good to see. And so if you're like a sports photographer or a wildlife photographer, those 40 frames per second can definitely come in handy. But if you're doing product or portrait or landscape, then that's less of a concern, and you can use either the electronic or the mechanical and still get amazing images because you're not worried about shooting too many frames per second anyway. It can have up to 8 stops of in-body stabilization, but that is when it's used in conjunction with a lens that has in-body stabilization as well. The actual camera itself has about 6.5 to 7, I think, from recollection. I may be wrong, but you do get up to 8 stops depending on which lens you pair it with. If I got the R6II and I paired it with either my 15 to 35 or 24 to 105, then yes, I would get up to 8 stops. If I used it with my 51.8, no. That lens does not have stabilization at all. I'm not going to badmouth that lens right now because this episode isn't about that, so I'll just move on from that. The R6II has a new feature which I haven't come across before, and that is pre-capture, where if you're focused on an object or a subject or whatever it may be, and you haven't pressed the shutter yet, but you start to press the shutter, it can actually capture images from up to 5 seconds before you have actually pressed the shutter down. So as an example, if you're taking a picture of, let's say you're at a tennis match and someone's about to serve, as if you start pressing the shutter down just as the ball hits the peak before the serve, it'll actually capture the images for up to 5 seconds before that, provided you've activated it naturally. It's not there by default. You've got to turn on that function. But the fact it's got that as an option so you can actually look at earlier images from before if you wanted to is actually pretty cool to have if it's a case where, you wanted to make sure you've got the shot but you're worried you missed it. Then at least having that option gives you the chance to go back and make sure you actually did get the shot if for whatever reason you did miss it by like 1 second or something. Which is a pretty good thing to have if you're often in cases where if you miss the shot, you can never recreate it. Like if it's sports or street photography or a wedding photographer, especially if you miss that first kiss when they're, pronounced husband and wife, and you've missed it by a second, at least with pre-capture activated, you've got the 5 seconds prior to that where you may not actually have missed that photo and you've got it and your customers are happy. You also do have HDR with moving subjects. So if you wanted to shoot HDR and you don't have a static subject, but a moving subject, that may come in handy. I honestly wouldn't use it for that particular case. I don't know how well that would work. I'd have to actually get the camera and try it out. But I think that's one of those things where it's nice to have it because so many screens nowadays are HDR compatible. And a lot of photographers I know are shooting HDR as well. And smartphones are shooting HDR. That now having HDR seems to be a relatively common thing. That it may come in handy to have that when you're shooting a moving target. Or moving subject. Moving target sounds like something out of a Hitman movie. It does have dual card slots, but they are SD UHS 2. So there's no CF Express A type card on this particular camera. It is just USH 2. But considering that it's a 24 megapixel camera and not 45 or 60, I think that shouldn't be too much of an issue. And like most cameras nowadays, it does have a fully articulating screen, which Canons have had for a while, so I'm not surprised that one's still there. As I said with regards to the Fujifilm earlier, I think camera manufacturers should just have them now as a default. They come in handy much more than they don't, and I would just rather get a camera that has it versus one that doesn't. It does have a few upgrades in the video features, where now you can shoot 4K 60 frames per second without a crop. So if you wanted to shoot wide, like if you're a vlogger or whatever the case may be, and you wanted to make sure there was no crop on your lens, you can chuck a 15 to 35 on there, or their 14 to 35 f4, and know that your image is not going to be cropped and you're capturing exactly what it is you want. It seems that Canon has worked a lot on their overheating issues as well, so that's good to know that your camera won't overheat and you can get quite a lot of recording time. I think with the 4K 60, they said the limit is 45 minutes before it does overheat, but that's providing you're shooting in 4K 60, not in any of the other frame rates. So if you're shooting like 4K 24 or 4K 30 frames a second, overheating isn't an issue, and it's got unlimited record time as well, if I'm not mistaken, so you don't have to worry about having to hit record every 29 minutes or every 59 minutes or whatever the case may be. You can also shoot in full HD 1080p at 120 frames per second, which is something that I'm also very excited about because I do like shooting videos from time to time and slowing it down, but it's just hard finding decent quality cameras that can shoot 120 frames a second that don't cost too much. At the same time, it is full HD, not 4K though, but when most people are viewing videos on phones and tablets nowadays, more so than the TV, it's not too much of a concern. And if you've got the right software, you can film it at 1080p, but still export it in 4K anyway. But the thing to bear in mind, if you do shoot at 120 frames per second, 1080p, it's actually saved in slow motion. It's not saved in whatever speed your action is moving, and then you can slow it down later on in your post-processing. It's actually saved in slow motion. So if you're filming, let's say, a 10-second quarter-mile drag race between two cars using the 1080p 120 frames per second, the actual video that you get is going to be 40 frames. It's going to be however long it is compared to your timeline. So if you're shooting on a 30 frame per second one, it's going to be 4 times slower. So just bear that in mind. And I think it's 5 times slower if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, but my maths might be wrong. No, it's not. It's right. So yeah, just bear that in mind. If you shoot 1080p 120 frames per second, it's saved in slow motion, not standard mode, not regular speed that you can then slow down. You will have to speed it up later on in post if you wanted to have it at a slightly higher frame rate than what you shot it at. Is this a camera worth upgrading to? If you've got anything besides their R3 or their R5, I think it's a worthy successor. You could say that it is a bit of a stopgap between the R6 and whatever it comes up after the R6II, but if you're a professional photographer or even a hobbyist and you want to get higher quality images because now it's 24 versus 20, or you want to do more video and you now have the option to shoot that 1080p 120 frames per second or 4K 60 without a crop, whatever the case is, I think this is actually a decent upgrade from any camera they've currently got, except for the R3 and the R5. Now, I say except the R3 and the R5 because the R3 is pretty much their current flagship camera. It's what any sports photographer or photojournalist uses nowadays because of the high frames per second, and it's got the built-in grip and everything else that the R3 has. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but also you cannot compare the R5 to the R6 because the R5 is 45 megapixels. And if you wanted to get a video one, you get the R5C, which has the built-in fan to help with the cooling factor, which can also film 6K and don't remember if it can film 8K, but if you've got an R6 and you want to print larger photos or you want to get more videos without a crop and not worry too much about overheating, then yes, the R6 is a solid, the R6 Mark II, is a solid option worth considering upgrading. It is released at the same price as the R6 was when it was released, which is $2,700 US, which means that the R6 has also dropped down in price by about $200 at the time that this one has come out. If you want something a little bit cheaper, you can go with the R6, but for the extra $200, I would say go the R6 II. It's got just enough features that have to make it worthy of the $200 extra cost. And I completely forgot to mention the button layout. They have moved the power button from the left side to the right side of the camera, so it's exactly where your thumb is, so you can easily turn it on and off when you want to. And then they've moved the option to swap between photo and video to the left side of the camera, where the power button used to be on the R6. So I like the fact that they've made that change, because that way, if you're walking around doing street photography and the camera's in your hand, it's easy to turn it on with just one hand and get your camera up to your eye and take a picture quickly versus having to reach for it with the other hand to turn it on first and then line it up. I know it sounds like a small thing, but as someone who uses the EOS R and always leaves it on to make sure I don't have to worry about that because the power button's out of reach, out of one hand that is something that is nice to have, because it just makes life a little bit easier when you're out and about. If though you're doing landscape photography like I do 99% of the time, Where the power button is obviously is of zero consequence because you're setting everything up properly, and once it's on anyway. But yes, it is a serious consideration to consider upgrading regardless of which Canon mirrorless camera you've got, or if you've still got a Canon DSLR like their old 5D Mark IV, I think that was the last one before they went mirrorless, then don't forget you can still get an adapter and put your old EF lenses onto any of the mirrorless systems. So it is a worthy consideration for an upgrade, and I am actually considering upgrading from my EOS R to the R6 Mark II. Yes, I do know it's dropping from 30 down to 24 megapixels, although for the actual image size you get out of it, it goes from 6600 down to 6000 pixels in the width and 4400 down to 4000. So it's only a 10% drop actually. It sounds like a lot more, but it isn't that much more of a drop in actual size. And I know that even at 24 megapixels, I can still print comfortably a 30 by 20 inch image, and the image is going to be tack sharp. And I would seriously consider getting this lens purely for the fact that it's a 24 megapixel and it's got the IBIS, especially if I just want to do a quick handheld image at like half a second on a 24 millimeter lens. Because right now with stabilization and everything else, because don't forget my EOS R doesn't have in-body stabilization, I've got to rely on the lens. But if I want to try and see how an image looks at half a second, I don't need to get out a tripod or find somewhere to stabilize the camera first. That's why I would seriously consider this. It's got stabilization that my current camera doesn't have. And if you're a professional who does this for a living and you've got an R6 or a 5D Mark IV and you want to upgrade, but an R5 is just over the top for your needs, then I would say, yeah, go get the R6, sell whatever you've got, get the R6, and then that way you're actually only paying for the difference between the two, and you can hopefully recoup that investment cost with the next few gigs that you've got lined up, so it's not going to hit your bank account too hard. But as I always say though, it's not up to me to tell you what to do with your funds. That's completely your choice. I just think it is a worthy upgrade. I almost sound like I'm trying to sell it for Canon. I'm not sponsored by Canon or anything like that. This is just my opinion on it, having been a Canon shooter for the past few years using an EOS R and not getting an R5 or an R6 yet. But I might get the R6II now that I see the specs that are there. But what do you think about both of these cameras, both the XT-5 and the R6II? Are they worthy cameras of upgrading from what you've currently got? Are they worth investing into a new system if you're not currently with either Fujifilm or Canon? All right, please let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear from you as always, because I do this to try and share as much information as I can with you, my audience. This is not to try and benefit me in any way. This is me doing my research, thinking about it, thinking how it would benefit you, and trying to pass that on. So what do you think about these two cameras, both the Fujifilm X-T5 and the Canon R6 Mark II? I think the Fujifilm's a nice looking camera. I didn't go with it just purely because I think the Fujifilm's a decent looking camera. The only reason I never went with Fujifilm to begin with is they didn't have a full frame option. That's literally it. I didn't want to go from crop sensor all the way up to medium format. I wanted the option to go full frame. But I can understand why some people like the Fujifilm cameras and the retro feels to it because of the dials. And if that's what you like to shoot with, then as long as it gets you out there taking photos, that's the most important thing. In regards to the R6II, I do think that is a serious consideration for an upgrade for anyone who wants to stay with Canon or is with Canon or wants to get into Canon, but doesn't want to have to get an R3 or an R5. Because it seems to hit the blend of both worlds quite well with their current specs of the 24 megapixel sensor, 4K 60 without a crop factor, which especially for people who like to vlog and they want to use their 16 millimeter to make sure that they've got the full view around them, knowing that there's no crop factor can make a huge difference. Right? That's the reason I actually don't use my EOS R to do anything in 4K. It's because it's got a 1.8 crop factor. So I just don't even bother using it. I use my Sony crop sensor because that's got less of a crop factor than my full frame camera. If you are considering getting into the Canon mirrorless system or you're already in it and you want to upgrade whatever camera you've got, then yeah, the R6II is something that's worthy of a serious consideration to upgrade. But as always, I would love to hear your opinions on it if you have them as to whether these cameras are any good or whatever the case may be. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget you can leave your comments down below and I will get back to you as soon as I can. And if you are listening on your favorite podcasting platform, whether it's Spotify or Apple Podcasts, if you do leave a review, I will read them and take any constructive criticism on board as to how this podcast can improve, because I do this for you. I do this to try and impart some knowledge onto you so that I can help you become a better photographer. And don't forget, if you would like to stay up to date with future episodes, if you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening on your podcasting platform, don't forget to follow us. It's completely free to follow us, regardless of which platform it is you use. And I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. As always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you on the next one. Have a good night or day, depending where in the world you are.